Kazuya, why do you think people build families? On a quiet autumn day, Grandpa asked me that question. It was just after the Buddhist memorial service held to mark the seventh day following my grandmother's passing. I was alone in the garden with Grandpa, staring absently into the sky at the time. I didn't understand the question, and, as I struggled to find something to say in response, Grandpa answered. He looked like he'd had an epiphany. So that they don't have to die alone. It occurred to me again and again as I was caring for your grandmother. Though we lost our son and your mother so soon, you were still here for us. Because of that, we had a sense of fulfillment in our lives. The bonds we've formed will last even after we ourselves are no more. For any living being, there can be no greater source of pride. Grandpa. That is why I want to tell you this. Kazuya, build a family. And, once you have, protect them, come whatever may. You've always been a sensible boy. No, I suppose I should say you always tended to think about things rationally. I was silent. But, listen, you mustn't do that when it comes to family. Once you've taken their hands, never let go. Put your life on the line and protect them to the bitter end, no matter what. If you do that, I'm sure you'll be able to think, I lived a good life, when your time comes. Just like your grandmother. And just like me. You're making this sound like it's your last will, I said teasingly, but Grandpa nodded in complete seriousness. I'm getting on in years. These may be the last words I'll leave to my grandson, who will one day be alone. At the time, I could say nothing in response. And now, as if he had only been holding on so that he could see me get accepted into university, Grandpa had left to be with Grandma. In that house where I was now alone, I whispered to myself. I know. I haven't forgotten your last will, Grandpa. To build a family, and protect them, no matter what. Holding that promise close to heart, I would begin my new life. That was how it was supposed to be. Oh hero, it is good that you have heeded my summons, said a middle-aged man who had just appeared before me. He was average build, and seemed to be attempting to sound majestic. I'd have put his age at around 40 to 50 years old. He wore a red cape thick enough to serve as a coat, and atop his head sat a gleaming golden crown. I could tell at a glance that this guy was a king. Was the gentle-looking young woman standing at his side the queen, then? She was a beautiful woman with platinum blonde hair, wearing a beautiful dress. She looked like she was only around 30. Let's take stock of the situation, I thought. A needlessly high ceiling, rows of marble pillars, and beneath me a red carpet. Soldiers standing at attention on either side, and mixed in with them a person who looks like your stereotypical prime minister. It was a place that looked like it came out of the opening of an RPG. There was a king, a palace, and that, oh hero, line I'd just heard. Okay, calm down, I told myself. Panicking will not improve your situation. The first order of business is. Right, I'll start by gathering information. Why do you look at me like that? Are you upset that I have called you here? The king said nervously as I stared at him. That's not it. I just don't have a good grasp of the situation. Could I ask you to explain? Why you certainly are calm. It is most enviable. Your Majesty. I began. It is nothing. The Prime Minister cleared his throat, and the king jumped a little. Seeing that little interaction, the queen giggled, and the soldiers looked on with wry smiles. From that exchange, I could see the king truly was the good-natured man that he seemed. I sensed that he lacked the aura of command required of a nation's ruler, but that he was the type who was loved by the people. Still, that was neither here nor there. I posed my question with deliberate calmness so as not to intimidate him. So, if I'm the hero, does that mean there's a demon lord invading or something? You certainly do catch on quickly. It is precisely as you say. I was speechless. Seriously. This isn't a dream, right? No, I just wanted to try saying that. I can distinguish between dreams and reality. This doesn't have that hazy dream-like sensation. All four of my senses, excluding taste, were reporting to me that this was the real world. This is reality. Let me say it again. Seriously. Is something the matter, hero? Why do you suddenly clutch your head? No, don't worry about it. I just felt a little dizzy. My head had started to hurt, but for the moment, I'd have to put up with it. I'm fine now. Please, explain the situation. Are you certain? Very well, I shall explain. The king then launched into a lengthy explanation of the world's history, like you might see in an old RPG. It was long-winded enough that, if this were a game, I'd have been hunting for the skip text button, so I'll summarize for you readers a bit. First, he spoke about this world. The world was made up of the supercontinent Landia and a number of islands of varying sizes. On the supercontinent Landia, there were many countries, large and small. In addition to humans, these were populated by beastmen, elves, dwarves, and dragonutes, among other races. There were countries where these races coexisted, countries where one race had preferential treatment, countries which forbade entrance to all but one race, and more. These countries took many forms and they struggled against one another for supremacy at times. However, ever since the Demon Lord's domain appeared, it seemed that all these countries had, on the surface, taken a position of mutual cooperation. Next, the king spoke about the Demon Lord's domain and the Demon Lord. Around 10 years ago, in the northernmost reaches of the supercontinent Landia, a dimension called the Demon World had appeared, and monsters of many sizes and shapes had poured out, throwing the northern countries into chaos. The countries had formed an alliance and organized a punitive force to send into this demon world. However, that punitive force had been annihilated. In the demon world, there were monsters, which had minimal, or, some would theorize, no intelligence, as well as demons, who were intelligent and also powerful fighters. The demons were the ones who had annihilated the punitive force. Furthermore, though it had not yet been verified, people whispered about the existence of a king who ruled over the demons, a demon king. After that battle, the countries had lost their main fighting forces, and none of them had had the power to defend themselves against the monsters that appeared from the demon world. The demonic forces, which had until then held only the equivalent of a small country, laid waste to the northern countries and came to rule a third of the continent. This territory was now called the Demon Lord's domain. While their advance had stopped for the moment, it was said that this was because the expansion of the front lines had spread the demons and monsters thinner, making it possible for the individual countries to hold the line against them. That didn't mean mankind had any decisive way to turn things around. In the front-line countries, things had bogged down to a stalemate. Following that exposition, the king talked about this country. This was the Kingdom of Elfrieden, a medium-sized nation in the southeast of the continent. It was ruled under a monarchy. It was a country originally founded by many races working together, and, though the king was a human, those of other races were accepted here without discrimination. Regardless of race, everyone held citizenship, and aside from king, they could take any job they desired. Even the prime minister who had been complaining to the king earlier was a half-elf, with human and elven parentage. Because they did not border the Demon Lord's domain, there were few monster attacks. However, the country had been weak to begin with, and the national treasury was not exactly in good shape. Food shortages had been especially bad in recent years, and that had only exacerbated the problem of refugees dispossessed by the expansion of the Demon Lord's domain drifting here. There were dark storm clouds on both the domestic and international fronts. Apparently, relations were tense with the Grand Chaos Empire, the largest country on the continent, excluding the Demon Lord's domain. The empire was the country which shared the longest border with the Demon Lord's domain. It was also the country that had directed the first invasion of the Demon Lord's domain. After their loss against the Demon Lord's domain, the empire was apparently requesting war subsidies from other countries. To put it simply, they were requesting that countries who were far away from the Demon Lord's domain provide financial support to those which were close to it. Though these were requests, when they came from the most powerful country of all mankind, they were closer to an ultimatum. One of those requests had come to this kingdom, but under current circumstances, it would be difficult to pay. Finally, the king talked about the hero summoning, which had brought me to this world. Apparently, in the request for war subsidies that came from the empire, there had been verbiage that had said, if you are unable to pay, carry out the ritual of hero summoning which is passed down in your country, and turn that summoned hero over to the empire. It was abundantly clear that this country had no means to pay, and perhaps that had been the empire's intention all along. Perhaps they wanted to use a hero for his fighting potential, perhaps they wanted to dissect one and study him, or perhaps they had no interest in one to begin with, and they merely wanted to use the kingdom's failure to respond to their request as a casus belli to invade. With no way to know what the empire wanted, speculation had led only to more speculation, and the kingdom had become suspicious of everything. In response to their situation, the kingdom had decided to perform the hero summoning ritual. They had not yet decided upon whether to turn the hero over or not, but if they succeeded, it would at least give them a card to negotiate with. For that, they needed to respond to the request, and show they intended to perform the ritual. Now that you've heard this much, I'll bet you've probably already guessed that the king never thought he might actually manage to summon a hero. Hey! I shouted at him without intending to, and the king jumped back in fright. Eek! I am most sorry. Oh, sorry, I said. I lost my composure for a second there. Even though he acts like this, he's still a king. I'll have to refrain from any further rudeness. Still, had I really been summoned by coincidence, with no one really expecting anything from me? After taking a moment to calm myself, I asked the king. So, what do you plan to do? About what? The whole, turning me over to the empire, thing. That is, what should I do? It is a real pickle. The king really did seem troubled. That surprised me a little. I had expected the empire is scary. Please, go and serve them for our kingdom. As he cried and begged me to do it. He looked pretty faint-hearted, after all. What is there for you to agonize over? I asked. You're afraid of the empire, aren't you? I am afraid. That is exactly why I am agonizing over this. If I may interject, allow me to explain, the half-elf prime minister said, stepping forward. At present, there is a clear difference in power between our country and the empire. We simply are not in a position to say no when the empire asks for something. While we are stuck in that situation, you are the sole lucky card that has fallen into our hands. Once we play that card, however, we have nothing left to use when negotiating with the empire. Even if we can survive this time by doing as they say, what will we do the next time something comes up? Next time, we might only have succeeded in giving up our only card. I was silent. It wasn't hard to see what he was saying. What had happened to northern Fujiwara after they had given up their only card, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, was a good example. Those who cave into intimidation, letting go of the only card in their hand, will have only a dark end awaiting them. What is a hero, anyway? I asked. It is said that a hero is one who leads the change of an era, the prime minister replied. So it's not just someone who slays that demon king. Isn't that a wee bit vague? I asked. We don't have much in the way of documentation, you see. Please don't hold a ritual if that's the case. I cannot apologize enough for this state of affairs, the prime minister said formally. Giving me the routine bureaucratic apology isn't going to help. Still, this is a problem. There's not enough information to act on. Which means what we need most right now is time. Sire, I have a proposal. What is it? You may speak freely. Can we talk about what's going to happen from here on out? Not standing here, somewhere where we can sit down and discuss it at length. Just me, you, and the Prime Minister. What do you think, Marx? That would be fine. The Prime Minister, whose name was Marx, nodded in assent. Since I had their agreement, I made another request. Please, also gather all the materials you can on this country. With a particular focus on the balance of payment reports, as well as materials on agriculture, forestry and fisheries, economy, trade and industry, and land, infrastructure and transport. We might be able to scrounge up the money the empire is demanding. Also, I'd like the materials you have on heroes. But, well, that can wait. Very well. I will have them gathered at once, said the king. We took a break at this point, and I was called to the king's governmental affairs office later. Sitting on a comfy sofa across from the king and Prime Minister Marx, we held meeting after meeting. That is, we talked about basically everything there was to talk about. This country's industry, economy, tax system, agricultural policy, military preparations, foreign affairs. We discussed it all. The meetings went on for a full 2 days. This was partly because I asked questions about every minute detail of the materials I'd had them gather, and partly because they latched onto the policies I was proposing to a degree that was bizarre. From partway through the meeting, the king was paying rapt attention to me, as if he had become an entirely different person. It was now 2 days later. The soldiers guarding the door would later tell everyone that, when the king left that room, his expression was uncharacteristically bright and cheerful, and that his was the face of a man who had come to a decision. The day after our 3-person meetings had come to an end, the king gathered the VIPs of the castle in the audience chamber, and proclaimed loudly, "My people, I ask you to heed my words closely. I, the 13th king of Elfrieden, Albert Elfrieden, hereby abdicate my throne to the summoned hero, Soma Kazuya. Further, I hereby announce the engagement of my daughter, Lisa Elfrieden, to Sir Soma. The room fell silent. Everyone had been struck mute. The only one present who remained calm was, perhaps, the Queen. This bombshell announcement completely blindsided me. 1. Fundraising. On the 32nd day of the 4th month in the 1546th year of the continental calendar, the throne was ceded to Soma Kazuya. It happened in the capital of the Elfrieden Kingdom, Parnham. This city was the capital, where the residence of the Elfrieden Kingdom's king, Parnham Castle, was. A town had risen up around Parnham Castle, and the circular walls surrounding it were reminiscent of a city-state in Middle Ages Europe. The roofs in the nobles' quarter and the peasants' quarter were uniformly orange, and this suited the classic image of the town well. Parnham Castle was in the center, connected with north, south, east and west gates by large roads that were always busy with carriages and large mounted beasts. Aside from the main roads, there were also countless smaller cobblestone roads radiating out from the castle, and these small roads were connected by yet more small roads. Seen from the air, it would have resembled a spider's web, or perhaps a snowflake. These roads were lined on both sides with merchants and tradespeople, and they were always bustling. Since today was a holiday, and also the first day off since the new king, Soma, though, with the crowning ceremony not yet having taken place, he was technically only acting king, had been given the throne, the marketplace was even more busy than usual. This sudden change of monarchs had caused tension in the castle town for a little while, but once they had heard that the throne had been ceded to the summoned hero, and that the former king, Albert, had announced his abdication of his own will, and that Soma was betrothed to Princess Lissa, the former king's daughter, the confusion naturally died down. Because the former king had ruled through being loved, the rumors settled down to, well, if the king is fine, I guess it's okay. Yeah, the pressure really seemed to be getting to him. I'm glad he has that weight off his shoulders now. He'll be able to take it easy now. It's best for everyone this way. The people's interpretations of what had happened were largely favorable. It seemed the king's lackadaisical manner was in tune with the national character. Having had the throne foisted on him, Soma had worried that a resistance movement might rise against the sudden change, but he was a little let down when it never happened. Regardless, it was another peaceful day in Parnham as people of many races went about their business. As if cutting through that peaceful afternoon, a white horse galloped down the cobblestones. The horse was spurred on by a beautiful young girl in a red military uniform that looked like it could have come out of the Rose of Versailles. She was 16 or 17 years old with fair skin, and platinum blonde hair that streamed behind her in the wind. Her tight-fitting uniform accentuated the well-balanced lines of her body. A beautiful girl riding a white horse made for a picturesque scene in its own right. The people she passed on her way let out gasps of admiration, which turned to cheers when they realized she was their country's princess. Congratulations on your betrothal, princess. We wish you happiness. The people sent her their warmest regards, with no idea how she herself felt about the matter. Of course, it was unlikely she could hear them now, anyway. Father, mother, please, be safe, she, Lissa Elfrieden, whispered to herself with a pained look on her face. Father, what is the meaning of this? Lissa demanded, raising her voice at the sight before her. The king's bedroom. It was a room large enough that the king-sized bed did not dominate it, and each and every piece of furniture was exquisitely designed. Originally, this bedroom had been meant to be the private quarters of the royal couple, so it should have been turned over to Soma when he ascended the throne, but Soma hadn't wanted to go through the trouble of moving in, so he had given permission for the former royal couple to stay, and they were still using it. Soma, incidentally, had brought a simple bed into the governmental affairs office and slept there. When Lissa ran into that room, out of breath, she was greeted by the sight of her parents not only elegantly enjoying tea on the attached balcony, but dipping scones in cream, raising them up to each other's mouths, and saying, "Say ah, darling. Ah." And feeding each other. Lissa fell to the ground, but quickly stood back up, and marched up to the former king, Albert, with anger in her eyes. Father, when I heard your throne had been usurped, I hastened back from my patrol outside the capital. So, why is it that I now find you two feeding each other without a care in the world? Lissa, in addition to her title as a princess though, following the abdication, she was now the new king's betrothed, had also graduated from officers' school and held an officer's rank in the army. She was not especially high in the ranks, but due to her high birth, she was often tasked with attending royal army funerals, or with other missions of a special nature. This time, she had been on a regional patrol, so upon hearing of her father's abdication, she had rushed to the capital. There was no usurpation, really. I abdicated of my own will, her father said calmly. Why would you suddenly do that? I had become certain that that man would make a better king for this nation than I. This is a decision that I came to as the one entrusted with this country, and I take full responsibility for it. I will tolerate no objections. In that one moment, Lissa saw the dignified authority of the man who had, until just recently, carried a nation on his shoulders, and found herself unable to object any further. But how could you decide my engagement without even consulting me? You may discuss that between yourselves. The betrothal was something I forced on him to begin with. If you do not want it, I doubt Sir Soma will force the matter. Mother, Lissa shouted. She turned to her mother for help, but Elisha just smiled. Meet Sir Soma for yourself first. This is your life, so you must decide what you will do with it yourself. Whatever your decision is, we will respect it. With not even a straw to grasp at, Lissa's shoulders slumped. She departed the room of the former royal couple and walked quickly across the palace. It had been some weeks since she had left this palace for her regional patrols. Something about the palace she had been away from for a few weeks caught her attention. Many of the servants were running around. The guards, the maids, the bureaucrats, even the ministers. Anyone and everyone was running. The sight of pudgy ministers running about and gasping with sweat beading on their foreheads was so surreal that she could only stare, dumbfounded. It hadn't been like this before. The castle she remembered had been a place so relaxed that it felt as if time just flowed slower there. The maids, the ministers. Everyone would walk slowly, and it was so quiet you could hear the palace guards training in the courtyard from anywhere in the palace. Hadn't Lissa joined the officers' academy because she had been sick and tired of that atmosphere? But what now? No matter where she went in the castle, the sound of footsteps echoed. Lissa called out to one of the maids who was rushing past. Can I have a moment? Why, princess? How may I be of service? The maid asked, slowing. Everyone in the castle seems to be in an awful hurry. Is there something happening? No, nothing in particular. Are you sure? It felt like everyone was rushing to do something. I am. But, perhaps it is our new king's influence. When we see how that man works, it makes us feel bad if we don't work, too. I couldn't stand to be slow myself, either. I'm in the middle of something right now, so I will take my leave. I see. Do your best. As she watched the maid speed off, Lissa was dumbfounded. For him to make even the maids feel this way, just how hard does the new king work? Just what kind of guy have I gotten myself betrothed to? Lissa found herself wanting to bury her head in her hands all the more. At last, she came to the king's governmental affairs office. When she opened the door, the first thing that she saw was a mountain of paperwork. On a desk large enough that two fully grown adults could have slept atop it, the papers were piled high and looked ready to spill over. That was not all. When she looked around, she saw a number of bureaucrats sitting at another long table, fighting a losing battle with yet more bundles of paperwork. As Lissa stood there, dumbfounded, a young man spoke to her from the other side of the mountain of paper. You, whoever just came in. What? Snapped back to her senses, Lissa had let out a strange cry, but the speaker didn't seem to care at all. Can you read? Can you do math? Don't mock me. I've certainly been taught that much. Well, perfect. Get over here and help me with the work. Just who do you think you are, asking me to help? Just do it. That's a royal order. Saying this, the person behind the paper mountain stood up. Now, finally, for the first time, the two came face to face. This was the first meeting between the new king, Soma, and his betrothed, Lissa. Lissa would later describe her first impression of him as a young man with tired eyes. In stories where a hero is summoned to another world, the hero sometimes gains powers as a result of being summoned. It seemed the people in this world all had some ability to use magic, and so where was the harm in hoping I might have gained the ability to use magic, too? Technically, I had been summoned here as a hero. So, right after I had had the throne ceded to me, some priestly-looking guys carried out an inspection of my abilities. Apparently there were various types of magic that people could use, and they had devices that could test it. This one looked kind of like a stone slate. When a person touched the slate, that person's magic type and abilities were displayed in that person's head. Not even the people of this world understood the principles behind how it worked, but it seemed there were a fair number of these sorts of out-of-place artifacts in this world. So, I got my diagnosis, and here was the power I'd gained, the power to transfer consciousness into an object and manipulate it. It was an ability that let me transfer my consciousness into objects I touched, and I could manipulate up to 3 of them simultaneously. It sounded more like a psychic power than magic, but the lighter the object, the more freely I could control it. I could get an overhead view of whatever I was controlling, as well. What was more, in addition to my own consciousness, I could have that object move under an independent consciousness, as well. Using an object as a medium like this, I could think about multiple things at the same time. While there was the limitation that I could only move around things close to me, being able to make things move around at will was neat. Like I was triggering a poltergeist effect. So, that was why I named my ability, Living Poltergeists. Sounds like I have a case of middle school syndrome, maybe. Having gained my Living Poltergeists, one thing immediately came to mind. This is going to be so useful for doing paperwork. Yeah. Copying my consciousness into 3 pens, I could review multiple documents simultaneously with parallel thinking, and by manipulating those 3 pens, I could sign off on them. Man, ever since I learned I had this ability, I've gotten so much more work done. Actually, without that ability, the giant mountain of paperwork that had piled up in the confusion since I had been given the throne would probably have buried me in an avalanche by now. Yeah, I know what you want to say. I get an ability, and it turns out to be mostly good for handling desk work more smoothly. While I was getting good use out of it, whenever I thought about it as a hero's power, I could only think, how did things turn out like this? I mean, even if I hadn't gotten super powerful magic that would let me take on hordes of enemies at the same time, I'd have liked some defensive magic that would at least let me protect myself. Well, wishing for things I couldn't have wasn't going to get me anywhere. And it was, as a matter of fact, a useful power to me. Today, as usual, I was fighting the mountain of paperwork with my living poltergeists. While I was doing so, someone entered the room with a thunderous noise that sounded like they'd tried to kick down a perfectly good door. When I peeked through a gap in the paper mountain, I saw it was a young woman in a military uniform. With her regular features, skin so pale as to be translucent, and silky platinum blonde hair, she was so gorgeous that at any other time I would have been captivated by her beauty. However, having pulled 3 consecutive all-nighters, I saw not a beautiful girl but just a new source of labor. After calling her over and practically forcing her to sit next to me, I pushed 2 stacks of paper in her direction. Please compare these 2 sets of documents and look for places where the values, or the number of items, don't agree and mark them. Huh. What kind of work is this? What, you ask? Digging for buried treasure. That's what, I explained to the perplexed girl in uniform. 4. Unaccounted for expenditures, to be precise. One pile is requests for budgetary appropriations, the other is income and expenditures reports. Even if the amount requested and the amount spent match, if the number of items differs, that can be indicative of either wasteful investment undertaken to fully use up their budget, or embezzlement disguised as investment. We'll check those, and if any laws have been broken, we'll make each of the responsible parties pay to make up the loss. If we uncover personal embezzlement, we will mandate repayment, and in the event they cannot pay, we will arrest the offender and seize their assets. You understood. Perhaps she had been intimidated by the threatening air of a man who had gone without sleep, because the girl nodded along as I talked. Good. Perhaps around 2 hours passed with her working quietly next to me. At last, the girl in military uniform spoke to me, her hands never ceasing their work of checking documents as she did. Hey. What? If you're tired, you can take a break whenever. No, that's not it. I haven't introduced myself yet. I am Lissa Elfrieden, the daughter of the former king, Albert Elfrieden. I stopped moving my pen. You're the princess, huh? I don't look like one. You were in uniform, so I didn't notice. But, yeah, maybe you do look princess. Why? At this point, she finally made me take note of how attractive she was. I'm Soma Kazuya. Technically, I'm the new king. Lissa turned to face me. She was pretty close, and we looked into one another's eyes. Unlike me, who was just taken aback, her golden eyes seemed like they were trying to evaluate me. After we looked into one another's eyes for some time, Lissa slowly opened her mouth. I'm not a princess anymore. Because you usurped the throne, my current position is a little unclear. Usurped. Your father pushed the throne and all his duties off on me, I'll have you know. Honestly, why do I have to go through all this pain and hassle? Seriously, what happened? I know you're the summoned hero, but how did that suddenly turn into you taking the throne? You tell me. I just did what I felt I needed to in order to protect myself. I explained what had happened around the time of the summoning ceremony to Lissa. When I had been summoned to this world, I'd been on the verge of being handed over to the Empire. The king hadn't seemed enthusiastic about the idea, but, seeing as he had no other plan, if the Empire had put pressure on him to do it, he probably wouldn't have had any other choice. There had been no telling what might happen to me if I was turned over to the Empire, so I had asked the king to choose the "do not hand over the hero" option. My proposal to the king and prime minister was that they pay the war subsidies to buy time, and with that time, push forward with policies that would build a strong and prosperous country. If they were saying, hand over the hero in place of war subsidies, all we had to do was pay the subsidies. If we did that, they would lose any justification for interfering in our affairs. It was not an actual threat, no matter what it seemed like. To keep up appearances, the Empire would not insist on it any further. That was my reasoning. We would use the time bought this way to pursue counter-strengthening policies which would let us stand on equal terms with the Empire. The two of them had objections, of course. They had said this country had no means to pay the war subsidies. But, after inspecting the materials they brought me, I was able to show that if we sold off some state-owned facilities, enacted caps on government spending, and the king turned over some of his personal assets, it would be possible to pay. I had gotten into the university's School of Socio-Economic Studies with the subject I had selected for the socio part of the entrance exam being world history, by the way, and my dream for the future had been to become a local government employee. This was all within my field of expertise. Hearing this plan, the king had taken on a ponderous expression, but the prime minister, Marx, had been enthusiastic. He must have ultimately decided that, rather than turn over the hero to preserve the status quo, enacting economic reforms was more likely to leave the country with a future. The king became more enthusiastic as we went on. As the guy who suggested it, I knew I'd probably be expected to put in a lot of the work on those reforms, but only as a single bureaucrat in the finance ministry. That was what I had thought. And then he pushed the throne off on me. Well, sorry. It's nothing you need to apologize for. If anything, you're a victim in all this, suddenly finding yourself engaged to me. Well, yeah, wait, which of us is higher ranked now? Do I need to be super polite and formal? She looked unsure of whether she should speak to me as a commoner would to a king, or as a princess who was candidate to be queen. We can keep it casual, I guess. I said. Sure. Also, don't worry about the betrothal thing. I'm just holding on to the throne for now. I'll probably quit this whole king gig in a few years, anyway. Why? Because I only ever planned to work hard enough to earn the subsidies for the empire so that I wouldn't be turned over. Now that I've been handed the throne, I'll do enough to get this country on the right track, but after that, I'll leave it to the people of this country to handle the rest. Of course, we can tear up the engagement then. I gave Lissa a reassuring smile. I'll probably quit this whole king gig in a few years anyway. My eyes went wide when I heard Soma say that. He makes it sound so simple. Does he even realize how difficult that would be? Even someone like myself, who had focused so much on military matters that my political knowledge was a bit weak, could see the situation our country was in. I believe the word was checkmate. Food shortages, economic malaise, the influx of refugees caused by the invasion of demons, plus pressure from the Grand Chaos Empire. We had nothing but uncertainty bearing down on us. For that reason, I could somewhat understand my father's decision to immediately abdicate the throne to someone he sensed was more capable. But still, considering all that, was it even possible to get this country back on track? Even supposing he somehow could, would the people allow a king who had accomplished such a great feat to retire so easily? So, do you think you can secure the funds for the war subsidies? Yeah, I've already secured the funds to send to the empire. Right now, I'm trying to squeeze out the funds for my reforms. They'll cost even more than the war subsidies, after all. Wait. He's already secured the funds. The amount the empire requested was so massive that it was equivalent to the national budget, from what I heard. Where did we have that kind of money? I sold off, like, a third of the treasure vault. The treasure vault. Our national treasures. Don't tell me you sold off our national treasures. You didn't, did you? I closed in on Soma, who looked very blasé about the whole thing. The national treasures belong to the whole country. Just arbitrarily selling them off is a betrayal of our people. Now, just calm down. If you say they're the property of the people, I'd say selling them for the benefit of the people is all good. Even so, there must have been objects with historical and cultural value. Oh, if that's your concern, I had those set aside. All I sold were jewels and ornamental objects that had material value. Soma looked through the paperwork for the treasure vault inventory. Treasures were divided into 3 categories. Category A, items with historical or cultural value. Category B, items without historical or cultural value but with monetary value. And Category C, everything else. We only sold items from Category B rather than sell the stuff in Category A. If we put it on rotating display in a museum, it's likely to serve as a more permanent source of income. Well, maybe. What about Category C? Magic tools, grimoires, and the like. Honestly, I'm not sure how best to handle them. You could say they're like weapons, in a way. We can't sell them off or put them on display without the proper precautions. That full set of hero equipment looked like it might fetch a nice price, though. Mind if I sell that? Please, don't. Technically, you're supposed to be the hero. Ah, wait, you're the king now, aren't you? But, if we have all this money, shouldn't it go to the military? In officers' school I learned, spend always on defense, never on tribute. Let me answer that pithy saying with another one. Time is money. Which is to say, by offering the war subsidies as a sacrifice, we can gain the one resource our country most needs right now. Time. Why do you have to talk in such a roundabout way? Don't worry about it. Anyway, even if we were able to strengthen our forces, it would all be for naught if we can't also get domestic issues under control. Until the food and refugee issues are resolved, we're only going to continue losing the support of the people. Once that happens, we'll be left with a fragile state that's easily thrown into riots with a little agitation by foreign actors. No, the people love this country, too. They wouldn't riot. You're being idealistic there. Only once one is clothed and fed does one learn manners. In the end, you can't have morals or patriotism on an empty stomach. If you're too busy looking after yourself, you can't afford to look after others. Suma's eyes were cold as he said this. It was a harsh and realistic view. That alone made me feel he was on the mark. From the look of him, you would expect him to be a weak man, yet somehow he looked so reliable. After spending another day, I was finally able to secure a certain amount of funds. While I wasn't exactly flush with cash, I would have the money I needed for my reforms for the time being. I managed to extract all of this money from just my direct holdings, without having to touch the 3 dukedoms, so I'd have liked some praise for that, at least. Looking around the room, it was a disaster. Bureaucrats were passed out on their desks, others were leaning back asleep in their chairs, their faces looking skywards. On the sofa, Lissa had lain down and was snoring softly. I moved over to her quietly, sat on the sofa's armrest, and watched Lissa sleep. In the end, this girl had stayed up until close to dawn helping me with my work. Even though she must have wanted to say a thing or two to say about being forced into an engagement with me. I patted her sleeping head. Her silky hair slid smoothly between my fingers. The excitement from being set free after such a long job must have been affecting me. Normally, I'd have been too embarrassed to do this sober, but just sitting here like this made me happy. MRM. Lissa groaned, so I pulled my hand out of her hair. The next moment, Lissa opened her eyes and sprung up. Maybe she was still a little groggy, since she was looking around all over. With a wry grin, I bid her good morning. Good morning, Lissa. Morning. Huh. Did I fall asleep? We've hit a good stopping point now. Do you want to go back to sleep? Oh, no. I'm fine. What about you, Soma? You haven't slept, have you? It looked like she was fully awake. I was happy to see her showing concern for me, too. Lifting myself from the armrest, I stretched my arms wide. I plan to have a good long rest after this, but could you come with me for a bit first? Where to? For a before-bed walk, I said. At the light of near dawn, Lissa and I bounced along on horseback. While breathing in the morning mist, Lissa's horse sped along with a clip-clop, not bothered in the least by the weight of 2 people. Lissa sat in the front holding the reins, while I was behind her with my arms around her slim waist, holding on for dear life. Hey, don't squeeze my belly so hard, she objected. No way. This is pretty scary. Pitiful. Normally shouldn't you, as the man, be the one holding the reins? Well, it's not like I had a choice. Since I've never ridden on a horse before. In modern Japan, there was rarely any chance to ride horses. At best, I'd ridden on a pony at the petting zoo as a child while someone else led it on a leash. In this country, pretty much everyone from peasant farmers to the nobility can ride, you know. She told me. In my world, there were many more convenient vehicles. Your world. Tell me about it, Soma. Did you leave behind any family, a lover maybe, in the other world? Lissa asked me hesitantly. Was she trying to be considerate of my feelings? No, nobody. My last relative, my grandpa, just passed away the other day. Yeah. I'm sorry. It's nothing to apologize about. Grandpa had a full life. That's why, well, nobody's waiting for my return, so I guess I don't feel the need to go back in any hurry. Oh, you don't. Lissa seemed somewhat relieved. As we talked, the horse kept clip-clopping along. It was around 6 in the morning, maybe. The time when people finally start to stir. As we passed through the shopping street, no shops were open yet and there was almost no one out. Passing through the castle town, we reached the wall that went around the capital. We came up to a massive gate, the likes of which I had only seen in foreign fantasy films, and after speaking to the guards there, we went outside through a small door beside it. Lissa did all the talking here. If the newly ascended king had told them he wanted to go outside the city without any bodyguards, I doubt they'd have allowed it. So, Lissa, who held an officer's rank, told them, I have been dispatched outside by order of the king, and played it off as part of her duties. Once we safely passed through the gate, Lissa added, since I said it was a royal order, there's going to be a record of it. Who knows what Marx is going to say to us later? I ignored her complaints. After a short trip through the city streets, we finally reached our destination. Stop here, I said. As she stopped the horse, Lissa looked at me questioningly. This is where you wanted to come. All I see are farmers' fields. Indeed, there was nothing but verdant fields of green leaves here. Green fields, wet with the morning dew, as far as the eye could see. This was the place. No doubt about that. This is the place I wanted to show you, Lissa. These fields. I suppose they're pretty when they're wet with the morning dew like this. Pretty. Huh. Even though it's because of this that people are starving to death. Wah. Lissa's eyes widened in surprise. I sighed. Take a close look. These, inedible fields, are the root of this country's food crisis. Inedible fields. That was what Soma had called the fields spread out before me, looking at them bitterly. Soma had said he'd wanted to show me these fields, but I still didn't understand why. What do you mean? Exactly what I said. All of the fields you see here are cotton fields. Cotton fields. Ah, that's what you meant by inedible. Cotton flowers were grown to produce cotton thread. Sure enough, these fields didn't grow anything you could eat. Soma sat down there, resting his elbows and his thighs. Jumping straight to my conclusion, it's the excessive increase in the number of these cotton fields that has caused this country's food shortages. Come again. Did he just sort of offhandedly say something incredible now? The cause of our food shortages. While I was sorting through the paperwork, I noticed it. With the expansion of the Demon Lord's domain, the demand for clothing and other daily necessities has skyrocketed. Of course, the demand for the raw materials has shot up, too. With the selling price of cotton flowers rising, and being able to sell as much as you can produce, the farmers have entirely stopped growing the food crops they had produced up until that point. Crops grown to sell to others instead of to eat are called cash crops. Which is to say, our farmers have turned to growing only cash crops, which has led to a lowering of this country's food self-sufficiency rate. I was speechless. The cause of this country's food shortages. I had always just assumed it was bad weather, or that our country had just had poor soil to begin with. Here was a concrete reason, and yet I, who had lived in this country for more than 10 years, hadn't seen it. Meanwhile Soma, who had been summoned here only a few days prior, had managed to. If I were to go a bit further, I could say it's the cause of this country's poor economy, as well. When the food self-sufficiency rate drops, you have to import from other countries to avoid starving. However, imported food involves transportation costs as well, so the price of food rises. That puts pressure on household budgets, but you can only cut food costs so far. If you don't eat, you'll starve, after all. Of course, if you're going to trim the fat somewhere, it's going to be in non-essential and luxury goods. This change in spending practices is causing a downward spiral in the economy. What had I been looking at? Had I just been a private citizen, it would have been fine to just laugh scornfully at my lack of insight. However, I was a princess. The ignorance of those at the top kills those at the bottom. I'm a failure as a royal. I lost all strength, falling to my knees there. In all my life, I had never so keenly felt a sense of powerlessness as I did now. Seeing me like that, Soma let out an, and an, scratching his head, before resting his hand on my head. Don't let it get you so down. We've secured the funding we'll need. It's not too late for agricultural reforms. What are you planning to do? Place limits on the growth of cash crops, bring back the growing of food crops, and improve our self-sufficiency rate. The country will pay subsidies to help support the transition. First, we'll replant the fields with beans, which have a wide range of uses, and potatoes, which are resistant against famine, and over time I'd like to increase the number of paddy fields. After that, Soma spoke eloquently of his plans for agricultural reform. He used a lot of words like paddy fields that were unfamiliar to me, but as I looked at his face in profile, he seemed so radiant. I felt I could understand why my father had abdicated the throne to him. He was what this country needed most right now. We had to do whatever it took to keep him tied down here. Our betrothal had probably been meant as another chain with which to bind him. I guess I can't afford to be upset about the engagement being decided without my input. Soma had said that once he got the country on track, he would return the throne, but we couldn't let him do that. It would be a loss to the country to have a man of such rare talent leave. It needed to be prevented at all costs. He says he has no family in his old world. If I were to become his family here, could I keep him in this country? I wondered, as his fiancé, if I can just make the marriage a fait accompli. Wait, the best way to make it a fait accompli would basically be doing that with him. The thoughts that came to my mind left my face flushed red. So, in the mountains we'll. Hey, Lissa, you listening? Eek. WHY, yes, I'm listening. Your face is all red, you know. It's just the sunrise. Think nothing of it.